Well, I started down a legal rabbit hole today trying to figure out why Republicans are so desperate to keep McConnell in office, even though he's clearly unable to perform the duties of the job. Well, as it turns out, through his illness, or whatever you want to call it, McConnell has worked them into a twisted pretzel of a legal trap because there could be a potential bomb, legal bomb, that could blow up in their faces because there's this big conflict between Kentucky law and the US Constitution over what happens when a senator can't complete his term. And once you understand that conflict, it becomes easier to see why the Republicans might prefer an incapacitated Mitch McConnell holding the office rather than asking him to resign or contemplating having the Senate expel him. Because as long as he remains in office, the Senate math is known. Republicans functionally lose one vote, but they still have their majority through January. And if a seat becomes vacant, then they introduce that introduces the possibility of it being filled either by a Democrat or possibly by Thomas Massey, which for them would be just as bad either way. And if by the time you're watching this video, by the way, McConnell has died, because it could happen before I have a chance to even upload it. But so that's a possibility. If you're watching after he's died, but this whole replacement situation is still going on, I'm going to explain, based on the law, what could possibly happen and what some of the alternatives are. I'm Jonathan Burton, and I was a Republican for more than 50 years until Trump came along in 2015. Now I'm doing everything I can to help ensure that Republicans lose control of Congress this November. All right, check this out. Did you know that no one can remove a senator simply because he's become incapacitated, even if he's in a coma? The governor can't declare him incapacitated and then, initiate removal proceedings. His wife can't resign for him. His staff can't, send in some letter saying the senator has resigned. And there's no 25th Amendment style process for removing incapacitated members of Congress. So they could be incapacitated for a long time, but as long as they're not brain dead, uh, they can't be removed unless they resign. But if you're in a coma, how do you resign? So they might be in a position where they're unable to resign, and yet legally they are declared alive, so they can't be kicked out of office for dying. So it's kind of a weird situation, but that's looking like what we're in now. There are actually only four ways a senator can leave office: he can resign, or he can die, or the clock runs out and his term expires. And there's one last possibility, which has never been used. Two-thirds of the Senate could vote to expel him, but that's always been used for moral problems or disciplinary problems in the past. So these rules create a bit of a bizarre situation, because if a senator is alive but physically unable to resign, because like I say, maybe a coma or something like that, then the only way to force him out before his term expires is through that two-thirds vote in the Senate. But that's never been used for this purpose. So that's extremely unlikely. Now, in my last video, I made a side comment saying that I wished Andy Beshear, Kentucky's governor, would simply declare McConnell incapacitated and begin the process to replace him. But it doesn't work that way. So that's not possible. The most Beshear can do is apply public pressure. The most he can do is what he's doing, actually. He's actually, now that I understand the legal uh, implications and complexities of this whole thing, I realize he's actually doing, pretty much the most he could do: send letters, demand proof of life, go on television, and force Republicans to answer uncomfortable questions. And that's exactly what he's been doing. And it's actually been working. It's rattling Republicans. Check this out. This is McConnell's Facebook page. Now, he went into the hospital, I believe it was on June 14th. I'm recording this on July 15th. So he went into the hospital on June 14th, and on June 12th was the last time he posted to Facebook until Andy Beshear started rattling his cage. Check this out. This is The first one I'll show you is a post from June 4th. Then his office posted something on his behalf on June 5th, all before he went into the hospital. This one's June 9th, so you can see that he posts his office posts for him every few days. And then June 12th, and that's the last we heard from him for a month. A month. Then on July 8th, Andy Beshear put out this letter where he was demanding to know what's going on with the senator. Is he alive? Is he conscious? And that kind of rattled them. So that was on June 8th. Oh, sorry, July 8th that the governor sent that out. So since June 12th, nothing had been posted. But then on July 12th, look at that, 4 days after the governor's letter, suddenly they post something. They resurface, they come back to life, and they post this picture that no one believes. Now, I've heard a couple of people who are experts in AI say that there's no sign that this is an AI photo. But, if you're an expert in AI, that doesn't mean they didn't prop him up and the minute this photo was over, he, went back to sleep. So I don't know what it proves, but in the day and age of AI, a still photo simply isn't enough and it's going to rouse suspicion. So, whether it's AI or not doesn't really matter. The fact is, they should have done a video. They should have had him call the governor. They're claiming that he can speak to senators for up to 20 minutes at a time. So call the governor and prove you're alive. Or call the junior senator, call Rand Paul from your same state. He hasn't done that. All right. So it looks like Beshear's demand forced McConnell's team to produce this. And Beshear started rattling their cage for 4 days. And 4 days later, they came out with this photo. And I bet they were panicking the whole time. I would love to be able to see what went on in that office when Beshear put this letter out, because this was their end product. And typical of MAGA Republicans, it was a pretty shoddy product. But why would Republicans want to pull the wool over our eyes by pretending that McConnell's okay, even though he clearly isn't, and he clearly can't perform the duties of the office? Well, I'm going to go into some legal reasons why I think this could be happening. Section 76 of the Kentucky Constitution lays out the process for filling vacancies in elected offices, and it says the governor has the power to fill vacancies. But Section 76 of the Kentucky Constitution was adopted 22 years before the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which established a new process for making temporary appointments. The 17th Amendment says the legislature of any state may empower the executive to make temporary appointments. So get that, it puts it in the hands of the legislature to decide how the governor can make appointments. So that gives the state legislatures the authority to decide whether or not their governors may temporarily appoint replacement senators or whether they have to hold a special election. And Kentucky's Republican legislature withdrew that authority in 2024 and instead required a special election to be held in the event of a vacancy. So my guess is that the Republicans would have the stronger argument here, the stronger legal argument, if this ultimately reached the Supreme Court. The 17th Amendment is part of the federal Constitution, so it would presumably control if Kentucky's Constitution conflicted with it. But that doesn't eliminate the risk, because Beshear could still argue that Section 76 gives him independent authority to fill the vacancy, even if he eventually lost that argument. The argument might be substantial enough to produce a court fight, and that could produce possibly an unpredictable and unexpected result. And politicians desperate to hold on to their power, they don't like unpredictable results. They don't like unpredictable anything. So as long as McConnell remains in office, in other words, he doesn't resign, he doesn't die, and they don't kick him out, then Republicans know exactly what it will cost them. It'll cost them one missing vote in the Senate. But if his seat becomes vacant suddenly, there are lots of questions and lots of opportunities for someone to throw sand in the works. And they have a Democratic governor, and what will he do? And, they can't predict that. So, and also, what could the courts decide? We think we know, but we don't always know what the courts will do. Could a Democrat temporarily end up in that seat before January if McConnell resigned or died? Well, a Democrat, that may not even be their worst nightmare, because if Beshear follows Kentucky's previous law and attempted to appoint McConnell's replacement, he would have to select a Republican. That's what that previous law demanded. So if he decided to call or if he decided to call a special election instead of appointing someone, either of those options could potentially open the door to Thomas Massey, President Trump's newest nemesis, President Trump's newest enemy. So that's a lot of uncertainty that I'm betting Republicans don't want to get into. And then there's one other strange detail, which is that Rand Paul was recently asked if he had spoken to McConnell. You know, Rand Paul is the other senator from Kentucky, and he said no. Now, think about that for a minute. The McConnell people have been going around saying that he's been talking to Republican senators all day long, apparently. So you'd think he'd at least speak to the other senator from his state, right? But he hasn't. And to me, that's evidence that McConnell probably hasn't spoken to any senator. It doesn't prove that he's completely incapacitated, but the fact that Rand Paul, who I trust more than I trust the guys who are saying that they have spoken to him, you know, if he hasn't spoken to Rand Paul, to me, that's kind of a sign that he possibly hasn't spoken to anybody, and that would suggest that he's really seriously incapacitated. But it doesn't prove it, but it does fit the theory that he's unable to communicate. So while he's obvious, and you know, this photo doesn't do anything to prove that he can communicate either. Maybe they can prop him up like that. He can sit up and put a smile on his face. Doesn't mean he can speak. And if you're a senator and you can't speak, you got trouble. You know, that puts a big dent in your ability to do the job. But anyway, he's obviously incapable of fulfilling the duties of a senator at this time. That's obvious. So, and it appears that MAGA Republicans would rather simply allow his seat to remain functionally vacant through January than to risk all these unknown alternatives of what would happen if he did resign, even though they, you know, have the apparent advantage to that, if that did happen. Anyway, they know if they go down this path, this path of pretending that he's okay and he's coming back soon, they know that if they do that, they will temporarily lose one vote in the Senate, but they've probably decided that opening McConnell's seat up to the governor's discretion, the Democratic governor's discretion, could lead to all kinds of chaos and unknowns, which could cost them much more than a temporarily vacant Senate seat. So they're willing to risk it and give it a shot. And that would explain why they're conducting what appears to be a cover up and why they're pretending that McConnell is doing just fine when he clearly isn't. Because they know the law, and they know if McConnell appears to be dead, they would have to hand things over to the Democratic governor. Um, and being MAGA Republicans, that's just something they're never going to let happen. They will never do that. They will never do it. So I think that's what's going on. I think that's why they're pretending that he's okay. I think that's why they're putting out pictures like this. And I think that's why they're going down in November, because people have seen it and they're fed up and they've had enough of this crap. So let's help them go down. Let's do everything we can to help. When you're on a sinking ship, the best thing is that it can sink fast, right? All right. I'm Jonathan Burton. I appreciate you watching. I will see you soon. Take care.